Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel where today we are going to be doing my April wrap up. So we're going to talk about every book that I read in the month of April. This video is not going to include any of my DNFs because I was doing my DNF project, which means that I had a lot of DNFs, and so I decided to go ahead and vlog that, and that video will be coming out sometime soon. But to jump right into the very first book I finished, that is Warprize by Elizabeth Vaughan. So this is the first book in a fantasy romance trilogy, and we are following our main character of Lara, who is the half-sister to the current king of a country that is at war with this more nomadic group of people, until one day the warlord of that nomadic group comes in and offers a full peace treaty to the king if he can take Lara as his war prize, which has some pretty specific meanings in his culture. And so Lara has to decide whether she's willing to go with him and essentially be a sex slave if that is worth a full peace for the rest of the country. And the story kind of goes from there. I have some mixed feelings. So I really like the writing of this. It sucked me in right away. I think that the cast of characters in general is pretty good. So the main cast of characters is pretty good. Our main characters are a little bit weaker. Like our warlord character is definitely kind of a big old stereotype, and sometimes Lara was just a hard main character to get next to. I don't think I ever truly liked her. But the rest of the cast was really interesting. I do think we needed a little bit more world building in this book. I know it's a fantasy romance, and so the emphasis is on the romance and not the fantasy. However, I didn't really feel like I had a strong foundation. I needed just a little bit more, and then I could have been really, really good with the fantasy side of this. The romance storyline itself, I actually really liked, and I really liked the fact that it was blended in with the other elements of this story. So there are like at least one other storyline going on in this book, and they just blend in together really well. There is still that strong sense of romance, but there's other things happening as well, and those two storylines very much affect each other in a really nice way. The one thing that I hated is that there was the threat of sexual assault for the vast majority of this book. Now, there is no sexual assault, and this is a reread for me, so I actually knew there was no sexual assault, and I still hated that it was hanging over my head. So it definitely affected my ability to fully enjoy this book. So what I will say is that if you want to try a warlord type romance, I would not necessarily start here, but if you already know you like them, this is not a bad addition. And I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. So then I picked up Sweep of the Blade by Ilona Andrews, and then later I also picked up Sweep with Me in the same series, The Innkeeper Chronicles. So Sweep of the Blade is book 4 in the Innkeeper Chronicles series, which is a series that posits that there are these inns on Earth that are run by innkeepers, and they essentially serve as way stations for aliens that are coming through this part of the galaxy, but it is very secret. The rest of Earth does not know that these aliens even exist, and so innkeepers have to see to their guests' needs as well as keep everything very secret. And in this book, we're following Maud, who is the sister of Dina, who has been our main character up until this point, Dina. But Maud is the sister, and she is going to an alien planet with Arland to determine if she is going to get involved in a romantic relationship with him. And of course, it's never easy, especially because she promised that she would never go back to vampire society. And the story goes from there. And I loved this. First of all, Maud, just like Dina, is an amazingly competent female character, which I adore. I love that her competence, while there is overlap with Dina's, which makes sense because they grew up in an inn together, and so they have this vast knowledge of alien species. The other part of Maud's intelligence has to do with the physicality. She is amazing with a sword and just generally being a physical kind of person. And I just really, really appreciated that. I also loved seeing like what Maud thought of Dina, because we haven't seen Dina from an outside perspective up until this point. So it was really interesting to see that. I thought, okay, so there's some hints of like this mystery. It was like the barest hint of a mystery about Maud in the first 3 books, with stronger hints in this. And I'm just like, okay, so there's this mystery here. When are we going to get to it? I'm really intrigued by that. And then Maud also has a daughter, Helen, who's integrated into the story. And normally I don't like kids in romance-based stories, but I thought it worked really, really well in this book. And then with the romance, there were 2 main things that I really, really appreciated that were done. First and foremost, Arland, our love interest, had feelings for Dina. And so Maud and Arland have to have this conversation about like, okay, so do you still have feelings? Like, did you just transfer them to me? Like, do you like me as an individual, or do you just like earthlings? Do you know what I mean? Like, so they had to have this conversation, and I really appreciated that they had the conversation and where that conversation kind of went, how Arland dealt with it, and the fact that he used all his words. I feel like sometimes romance novels don't necessarily address these very real questions that real people would have. So I really appreciated that part. And then also, I really liked that Maud was dealing with trauma in a very realistic kind of way. She has this traumatic past, and so she still has some trauma responses. And yes, it does affect her relationship with Arland. And Arland doesn't really push her on it, like, or say that she's wrong. And so I just kind of like that both of those things were integrated into this romance. So yeah, I really, really liked this book. I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's pretty close. And I gave it 4.5 stars. And then the novella, Sweep With Me, we go back to Dina. And this novella is really dealing with the aftermath of book 3 from Dina's perspective. So book 4 is dealing with like the aftermath of book 3 for Maud. And this novella is dealing with the aftermath of book 3 for Dina. There are some loose threads that we absolutely have to tie up. And I appreciate that we didn't linger on those threads for too long. But unfortunately, we had a lot of interesting alien species in this novella and like almost no time to really explore them. And especially because in this instance, I actually did have some questions about one of them. So like, even though I really liked it and I really liked what was going on, I did think it was too short. So I liked it, but I just really wanted more, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then after that, I picked up Spoiler Alert by Olivia Dade, which is an adult contemporary romance where we're following our main characters of Marcus and April. Marcus is an actor of a very popular fantasy TV show, Gods at the Gates. At the Gates. I don't exactly remember, but he is wrapping up his last season. And April is a geologist who is really into this TV show and cosplays and everything. So when the marketing team for this TV show puts out a tweet asking for people to post pictures of themselves cosplaying, April decides to take the plunge and do so. And she unfortunately attracts a lot of trolls because she is fat. So when Marcus sees this and sees that the trolls are absolutely unwilling to back off, he decides to ask April out on a date, which they go on, only for Marcus to find out that actually April is his beta partner, that they've kept their identities fairly anonymous, so he only finds out because she tells him her name, her username. So it's his beta partner that he started a server with 2 years ago for this TV show, and he can't tell her because that would potentially absolutely ruin his acting career. And the story goes from there. And I have very mixed feelings about this. So generally speaking, I really liked the characters of Marcus and April. I just think that they're really well-written people with really interesting and understandable kind of life problems. I love the representation there. April is fat, and Marcus, we find out still in the beginning, but a little bit later in the beginning of this book, we find out that he's got dyslexia. And additionally, these are two characters that are in their late 30s, early 40s. So I just really appreciate all that kind of representation. I absolutely loved the fact that some of the scripts are included. So Marcus has been acting for like 20 years and he's been in some terrible movies. And so when some of those terrible movies are mentioned, we will then get an interlude with like a couple pages of script so we, the readers, can see just how terrible these movies were. And I adored that. And then like also, as we're mentioning fan fiction more and more, we do occasionally see snippets of fan fiction as well. And I think that that's just an amazing touch. However, what I will say is I think that tonally the first 2/3 of this book did not match the last third. So the first 2/3, we do have some heavy topics that we're dealing with: fat shaming, fat phobia and fat shaming, not just from the wider community, but also from family members, and dyslexia and like how that can really negatively affect your life, especially when you don't get diagnosed until very, very late, and how Marcus has been dealing with that. These are some heavy topics, but like the overall feel was very lighthearted with some gentle touches into these heavy topics, done in a very good, it was done very, very well. And it wasn't like, there was still appropriate amounts of weight given to it, but we didn't linger. And so it still felt very lighthearted. And then the last third, it just felt very angsty and heavy, and it didn't have those lighthearted touches. And we didn't have any of the funny little scripts or anything like that. It was just kind of angsty and like wrapping up these heavy storylines. And so even though like I completely understand why we had to wrap up those storylines, again, I don't think that we transitioned into it very well. I think it could have maybe been done a little bit differently. So even though you are dealing with these very heavy topics and they should be given the appropriate amount of weight, like I think that it could have been done a little bit differently so it flowed better. And I just personally, especially because I was enjoying that lightheartedness so much, I did not like this transition, especially because there wasn't really a transition. It just felt very abrupt. And that, coupled with the whole premise of Marcus just choosing to not tell April, didn't quite work for me. Because the whole thing is like, when you hear that description, you're like, okay, so he's not going to tell her until she either finds out or she forces his hand, in which case she's going to be so upset and think he's untrustworthy, and that's why they're going to break up in the third act. And like you just know that, right? That's like, of course this is how it's going to go. And so you're just waiting for that to happen. And so I didn't really like that either. I do appreciate many ways of how this premise was actually handled. I completely understand a lot of Marcus's choices, although some of them I wasn't quite on board with. So I do think that it was written pretty well if you're okay with that. I just don't think I was going to ever be okay with that. And again, with the different tones in the different parts of the book, this, like, there were so many parts that were really, really good. And overall, it just didn't quite work for me. I still gave it 3.5 stars because of the strength of like the parts that I did like. But yeah, not as good as I wanted it to be. And then I went ahead and picked up A Local Habitation by Seanan McGuire, and then a novelette at the back of this hardcover called Strangers in Court. And they are both part of the October Day series, which is an adult urban fantasy series where we're following our main character of October Day, who is half fae and half human and a knight in the fairy realms. And she usually gets thrown at these weird problems because she's the only person that has any idea of how to potentially solve those problems. And in A Local Habitation, Toby gets sent on a diplomatic mission because the niece of her liege lord, and this niece also happens to be a countess in a local tiny county, has quit answering her uncle's phone calls. And so Toby needs to go and make sure that everything is okay. But when she gets there, she realizes, no, everything's not okay and people are dying. And so she's got to figure out what's going on and try to prevent any more people from dying. I'm not going to do a super in-depth review here because I have done a review on this channel before and I will link it down below. But essentially in this one, the first half is really rough. The writing style is definitely a step up from the first book. Like the writing itself, everything from the characterization to the world building to the writing is all a step up from the first book in terms of quality. However, all of the people in this county are really like horror movie stupid, which makes sense because they're fae, they're immortal. The one rule that Oberon gave them was don't kill each other, so they pretty much try to do that. So they just don't have a well-developed sense of self-preservation. And in addition, they're very secretive, which is, again, purebloods tend to be much more secretive, so it's very understandable. But these two things mean that, like, people keep dying, and Toby can't do anything about it. So it's just really frustrating when they're like, I'm going to go off and do this thing all by myself, and oh, they turn up dead. And you're like, of course you died, because you don't know the basics of horror movies. So that was really frustrating. However, in the second half, they realize, oh, they actually need to take their safety seriously. They start doing so. They start sharing some of their secrets. It just gets a lot better in that second half. But I also really like this book because in many ways, Toby fails in this book. And these failures have consequences. And it's interesting because we can see kind of some of the consequences that are starting and like in this book. But there are consequences for this down the road that we see later on in this series that I kind of adore that they're there. And so, like, having read the whole series and coming back to this book, it's really interesting to see, oh yeah, that's where that started. So this is a hard book for me personally because I'm like yelling at the characters in the first half, but there's so much good going on that I still really like it. And I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. And then for Strangers in Court, so the whole premise of Toby is that she is a knight, but it's really unusual for her to be a changeling and a knight. And we know from like the world building of the first books that she's a knight because she essentially found a new no for the queen, and so the queen allowed her to follow this path to become knighted. And so Strangers in Court is the story of how she found the new no. And it's fascinating because, like, again, I've read the whole series. So going back to the first book in this series, it's just like night and day how Toby thinks. Like, she's just changed so much. And this novelette is set like at least 15 years before the start of the first book. So Toby is even more different from the first book. And so how she thinks about things and what she thinks is possible in fairy is just, it's so fascinating to see her thoughts. And with that, there's a lot of Easter eggs that were put in that completely make sense. And you're also just like, oh, Toby, just you wait. So I really, really liked that. The story itself is interesting enough, although what I will say is that the appeal is definitely going to be seeing Toby so much younger. And so if you're into this series, it's a really great novelette to add in. But if you haven't read this series, you're not really going to care about this book. But I liked it and I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then I finished Wonder Woman Tempest Tossed by Laurie Halse Anderson. And this is a young adult origin story for Wonder Woman. It's also a standalone, but it's a pretty standard origin story where we're following Diana at 16 and she gets kicked off her home island and she has to kind of learn how to live in the wider world. And I don't know that I was ever going to truly love this because it is YA and I'm not doing great with YA as of late, but also there were some definite negatives with this specific graphic novel. First and foremost, the plot felt a little bit rushed and a little bit thin. And because of that and a couple of other things, really this felt like the first book in a series. But again, I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure it's a standalone. So it didn't quite hold together. It would have been fine if we were going to explore some more of these things in like a second volume. But because we don't, it just doesn't quite hold together. And it's not doing very much that's really all that interesting or different for a Wonder Woman comic, except for one thing, which I actually really did appreciate, and that is Steve Trevor. The character of Steve Trevor became two male characters, Steve and Trevor, and they are a couple. And I thought that this was just a really nice way to pay homage to Steve Trevor as a character while also not having him be part of the story, because a lot of times when he's part of the story, it makes it more of a romance. And I just appreciated that this was an origin story where there was no romance in it at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with a romance as one possibility, but it's been frustrating because almost every origin story has that romantic angle. So it was just really refreshing to have a book that did not have that. So, but other than that, like, I didn't really think it was all that unique, and I ended up giving it 3 stars. And then we have Visions in Silver by Anne Bishop, the 3rd book in the Others series, which is an adult urban fantasy series. And in this, it posits a world where before there were humans, there were the Terra Indigene, the Others, the people who became what we know as shifters. And in America, they are the caretakers of the land, and they essentially allow the humans to live on it, as long as they're not doing any major damage. Enter our main character of Meg Corbin, who is a blood prophet, and in the 1st book, she is actually on the run from the person who used to own her and cut her skin against her will for these prophecies. And I can't really actually get into much of anything of a description for the 3rd book because it's all spoilers. But it is the next book in that series. Now, obviously, there's a lot of content warnings, so be very careful. And this is another one that I'm not going to get too in-depth in because I have done a spotlight on for this series, which I will leave linked down below. But this is like my 5th time rereading it. And what I realized on this reread, 2 things. I was really, really struck by how much overlap there is between Meg and what she's dealing with and how autism presents. It's not one-to-one. She's not autistic, but she deals with a lot of the same things. And how it was written was just done really, really well. And the other thing is, this is the book that has my least favorite scene out of the entire series. And even though that scene is very well written and very much in character and absolutely necessary to move the character arc forward and to some extent the overall plot forward, I was dreading it. It was only 20 to 25 pages and I was absolutely dreading it. And so a good chunk of this novel, I was just like, I'm enjoying this, but I don't want to get to that scene. And so because of that, I did like downgrade my rating down to a 4.5, but it's still really good. And this series overall is just fantastic. And then I finished Middlegame by Seanan McGuire. And this is the 1st book in the Alchemical Journeys series, which is a series of companion novels. And I don't actually know what genre this fits into. It's adult, it's some kind of modern contemporary with magic kind of thing. But essentially we have a person, an alchemist, James Reed, who has decided that he is going to try to embody the doctrine into humans. Essentially, he's created these humans to be vessels for this doctrine, and in doing so, as soon as they manifest, they can control reality, and if he's controlling them, then he can control reality. And the story kind of goes from there. This is a really rough read in terms of it packs huge emotional punches throughout this book. There are a ton of content warnings. Please, please be cautious with this, especially because there is a described attempted suicide. So like there's a lot of stuff going on. But this is a reread for me, and I absolutely appreciated so much more of this book on a reread because there is some funky like things with the timeline that I didn't quite understand the first time through that I understood so much more on the second time through. I could really much more appreciate the character interactions on the second time through. It was just overall a really great experience, and like the writing itself is just done really, really well. However, within this series there is a children's series, a fictional children's series. Sorry, there is some thunder. There is a in this fictional world, there is a children's series that is very heavily integrated into this plot. And we do get excerpts from that book, but I didn't think we got quite enough for me to feel grounded. And I'm not sure that I'm actually supposed to feel grounded, but I just really wanted a little bit more understanding of how that fictional story and this book kind of interact. Now, the fun thing is that Seanan McGuire, writing as A. Deborah Baker, is actually writing this children's story like in the real in our world, and it starts with Over the Woodward Wall. And so I'm gonna read that series and then come back and reread this book, and I think I'll understand even more. But overall, I really like this. I think it's really well done. It's not necessarily what I come to Seanan McGuire for, but I can still appreciate how well it was executed. And again, I still really enjoyed it. So I ended up giving this book 4.25 stars. And then the last thing I finished is Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Strategies for Urgent Challenges by June Williamson and Ellen Dunham Jones. This is a nonfiction, specifically a textbook. And this is broken up into two different sections. The first being the problems that suburban areas create that need to be addressed. And then the second part, which is case studies in retrofitting these suburban areas and which problems they chose to face and how they addressed them. And I overall thought this was really interesting. However, this is definitely a textbook for people who are like later stages of like a planning degree, a city planning kind of thing. So I didn't quite know all of the terminology. I had to have Google open for quite a while because I was just like, I don't know what this is. But then, so just keep that in mind. But it is fascinating. I did have a number of problems with this book though. First and foremost, there's some hinky stuff with relating, like linking health and obesity. Like basically, like we can tell Americans are unhealthy because America is getting fatter, which is like not accurate. So I hate that it's included. There was also like a casual sexist remark, which made me want to scream. So there's stuff like that that crops up on occasion. But just on the content, like one of the things that I thought that I would have liked to have more of a variety of case studies, because a lot of things, what I found is that, for example, when they were going into suburban areas, they did a lot of the case studies were focused on high density mixed use, which is absolutely one way to address some of the problems, but it's not the only way. And I hate that we didn't get more case studies that were like, this is one way to like deal with the auto dependency problem in suburban areas without necessarily making it into high density living. And I don't even mind that there were like, you know, I don't mind when there are projects to make higher density in like living in suburban areas, but I live in the suburbs for a reason, and it's mostly because I don't want to live in a downtown area. That's too many people for me. So like sitting there and being like the only real suburban retrofits that work well are high density, and especially high density mixed use, I hate it, because it's saying that like, to me it feels like you're saying that that's the only way to address these problems. And I'm just like, no, but I want those other problems to be addressed without making it high density. So can we do that too? And I just don't think we got enough examples of that. There was like one or two, but not a ton. And they also were kind of terrible about addressing some of the problems that these retrofits create. In one example, there was a town that was dealing with some stormwater problems. Essentially, their stormwater pipes were linked with their sewer system. And so when there was a really bad storm, the sewer system would back up because the system just couldn't handle both things at once. And so they had to figure out a different solution. So they decided to make a park with like a big old pond in the middle, which is intended to be, this is where stormwater collects. And they did it intentionally next to high density, low income housing that didn't have access to a lot of green spaces so that they could enjoy this green space. Well, in that case study, the authors do point out, like, a lot of those low-income residents were displaced because this became such a popular area that they couldn't afford to live there anymore. And, like, yes, they mentioned that this is a problem, but they put very little emphasis on it. And because there wasn't as much of an emphasis, it felt like it's not ideal, but it's okay that these residents were displaced because we were dealing with these other problems. And I inherently don't think that that's okay. So yeah, so there's some of that kind of stuff going on throughout this book where it just doesn't necessarily address any of the negatives that are created by some of these retrofits, which I also just didn't really like. So yeah, I think it was really interesting. I learned quite a bit, but I think that it needs some editing. I think it needs some fixing. But I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. And that is it. That's everything that I read in the month of April. If you have any thoughts or feelings about any of the books that I mentioned, please leave me a comment down below. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to, and until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!